All right, everyone. So let's talk about Libya and some of the very interesting aspects that went around the US's intervention in that country and the whole thing with regime change and all that very, very fascinating stuff. So, Gaddafi was portrayed as this crazy kook dictator, totalitarian, bipolar, mentally ill, Middle Eastern tyrant, despot, some crazy guy who lived in a tent. And so he was portrayed this way. And he was portrayed this way for a reason. It was to make him look like he was an unstable dictator. An unstable dictator who was a threat to the US. And so he was portrayed as being a member of this Middle Eastern axis of evil. Conservatives hated him. People like John Bolton wanted him dead. And it just seemed like whatever Gaddafi did, it wasn't good enough. It's not good enough. We need more from him. He's Hitler. He's a modern day equivalent of Hitler. He's a North African version of Adolf Hitler. Except this Adolf Hitler just likes to drink black tea and live in a tent, which is kind of, interesting and all. So Gaddafi, when you talk to neoconservatives about Gaddafi and why it was wrong to remove him, neoconservatives and probably neoliberals, because his murder was done under the Obama administration, they'll argue and say things like, well, he was a supporter of terrorism and he backed the IRA and all that stuff. Or, he was a tyrant and he just lashed out at his people for no reason, out of nowhere. Just woke up, drunk a cup of black tea, got out of the tent, and he just decided he wanted to kill his own people for no reason. I mean, isn't that just crazy? And so they'll use these types of arguments to justify why he needed to be removed. And no matter what you tell them, you can tell them the reality of how dark Libya is as a result of removing Gaddafi. You could talk about all of the political and societal chaos that resulted from the removal of Gaddafi. You could talk about the fact that there was a huge amount of violence that was done by racist anti-Gaddafi militants against the black African minority in Libya as a result of Gaddafi being removed and murdered. But they'll say, well, it doesn't matter. It's terrible what happened to those people, the civilian loss, the suffering, but that's what happens when you have a dictator in power. That's what happens when you have a tyrant in power. People are going to suffer, and you got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. And so if you want to remove a Hitler, when we got rid of Hitler, there was a lot of suffering that went on too. So you can't really reason with these people. You just can't reason with them. It's like talking to a wall. I mean, worse, because this is a human being, and a human being is a lot more dangerous than a wall. Unless, of course, the wall collapses on you. But here's the thing about Gaddafi and that whole strata of Middle Eastern dictators that we got rid of, which was a terrible idea and it had so much destructive consequences. These people were manageable. Saddam Hussein, Mubarak, Gaddafi, these guys are manageable. The United States, all of these think tankers, war hawks, war lobbyists, whatever you want to call them, they will make it seem like these people are the worst thing ever. And we have to help these rebels, whoever they are, right? We have to help these rebels and we have to arm these people. But the fact is that these tyrants, these dictators who we portray as being so evil and dark, who we portray as being almost Hitlerian, axis of evil and all that, they are actually very manageable in comparison to what comes after their demise, what comes after their toppling. Gaddafi was very manageable. While he did back some terrorist groups supposedly. Gaddafi wanted to make a good image for Libya in the world. He wanted to make a good image for himself for the eyes of the Western powers, especially the United States. So the big thing against Gaddafi was that he was behind the Lockerbie bombings that took place, or the Lockerbie bombing that took place in the 1980s, in which there was a bomb in a plane, the plane blew up, and a lot of people died. And the big accusation was that Gaddafi was behind it. He was the guy behind it. And Gaddafi denied being behind it. But here's the thing is, there was all sorts of demands made for Gaddafi. And they were saying things like, well, if he wants sanctions lifted, he has to turn over the terrorists and to pay compensation. This is what was being argued. And the sanctions on Gaddafi began once it became widely believed that he was behind the Lockerbie bombings. Now, initially, the view was that Syria and Iran were behind the Lockerbie bombing. But then there was some peace talks between Syria and Israel and other Arab countries, and so they needed to make Syria look good, so they said, actually, no, it wasn't Syria. It was really the Libyan guys. Yeah, sorry, big mistake. Sorry, Assad. It was really the Libyan guys that did that. It was that Gaddafi guy, you know, that guy who drinks black tea and sleeps in a tent and has all those female bodyguards? Yeah, it was that guy. And so they put the blame on Gaddafi. And so they switched the narrative. They controlled the narrative, is what they did. And now Gaddafi was the big bad guy who was to blame for Lockerbie. So Gaddafi was like, well, you know, you got these sanctions on me and you're trying to destroy my economy. And the response to him was, well, if you want the sanctions removed, you have to turn over the terrorists who did this, and you have to pay compensation for all the families of the victims of the Lockerbie bombing. Now, there was some resistance to this, of course. There were hardliners in Libya who were like, don't turn in the terrorists, don't pay compensation, don't acquiesce to the West. But then Gaddafi said, you know what, we'll turn in the terrorists. So there were two guys who were believed to be behind the Lockerbie bombing of the Pan Am plane. So Gaddafi had the two guys turned over to Scotland, and they were tried in a Scottish court. One was found guilty, one was found innocent, which is pretty weird. And then they were like, well, it's not enough. We want compensation for all the families of the victim of the Lockerbie bombing. What compensation? And the lawyer for the Lockerbie, the lawyer representing the families of the Lockerbie victims, his last name was Gerson. And Mr. Gerson said that he demanded that, you know, the Libyan government give over $2 billion to the Lockerbie families. I think it was like 2.5 billion or something like that. And Gaddafi was like, okay, you want money? You want the billions? Lift the sanctions. Lift the UN sanctions and lift the American sanctions. Okay. So Gaddafi paid the money. Billions of dollars went to the victims, the families of the victims. What does this all mean? He was manageable. And I want to read to you guys some excerpts from this book I've been reading on the Gaddafi regime, the fall of the Gaddafi regime. So I'll read to you guys some lines here. It says here that in the late 1990s, the U.S. was virtually unconcerned about Libya's WMD program, with the exception of its chemical weapons capacity. And even this was not the primary area of focus. He wasn't a threat. He has world weapons of mass destruction with WMDs, man. The U.S. wasn't concerned. What does this remind us of? Reminds us of what happened with Saddam Hussein. Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, they weren't concerned with Saddam. They weren't. I think Condoleezza Rice, in fact, wrote an article about how even if Saddam had a nuclear weapon, he still wouldn't be a threat. Cheney himself said, I'm not interested in going to war with Iraq. They switched their opinions. I wonder how that happened. Was that a coincidence at all? Okay. So it says here, Vice President Dick Cheney made the connection even more bluntly. One of the great byproducts of what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan is that 5 days after we captured Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya came forward and announced that he was going to surrender all of his nuclear materials. What does this mean? He was manageable. These people were manageable. They were controllable. Saddam, all these guys were controllable. So it says here, there is little doubt that Libya had many, if not most, of the pieces needed to make a nuclear weapon. Was Gaddafi anywhere close to actually making a functioning nuclear weapon? The strong majority of international analysts in this domain think not. In fact, the Secretary General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, said that the Americans were very angry when he refused to make Gaddafi look like a threat. And he said, quote, the Americans were unhappy. And his name, by the way, was Mohammed el-Baradei. And Mohammed el-Baradei, the Secretary General of the IAEA, said, the Americans were unhappy and that I characterized the Libyan nuclear program at first glance as nascent. The intelligence coup would have seemed more significant if it had been larger or closer to producing a weapon. So the IAEA said, hey, Libya, not a threat. The Americans were pissed off about that. It's the same story every single time. IAEA said, hey, Iran isn't a threat. They're following the rules. Oh, no, we don't believe the IAEA. They're all liars. Just out of nowhere, they want to lie for some reason. IAEA said Gaddafi is not a threat. Oh, no, can't believe that. Gaddafi, pay us over $2 billion. Oh, here you go. Just lift the sanctions. Okay. Gaddafi, turn in the terrorists. Okay, here you go. Just lift the sanctions. What does this mean? These guys were controllable. Now that you got rid of these people, look at the chaos in the Middle East now. With all the fighting happening in Libya, the fighting happening in Syria, even though Assad is still there, Syria is no longer a functioning country. I mean, you might as well just say the Assad regime is dead because Russia is there controlling it. Turkey is there controlling sections of the country, specifically in the north. The United States is still there. It's still a huge focus for NATO. You have all these rebels there who have been armed by foreign countries outside of Syria. I mean, you look at what's happening. It's complete chaos. And now you have a whole migrant crisis, a second migrant crisis taking place. It's all the result of NATO intervention. NATO intervention. Makes you wonder why the military is having such a difficult time recruiting people. They'll say, well, millennials are weaklings. No, it's because we're actually reading the information on the internet and reading books on the military, and we saw what happened in Iraq, and we're like, hey, we really don't want to be in the military when we know that you're just going to send us off to do these wars and die, not for our freedom, but for some corporate interest. And these wars cost millions of lives. It's pretty horrendous. Pretty horrendous. So all this propaganda about Gaddafi or whatever, anytime you hear propaganda, anytime, you have to read between the lines and you got to do your own research. You just can't sit there and wait for the CIA filtered news to tell you what to believe. This is one of the glories of the internet. You know, they'll say, oh, millennials are weaklings because we don't want to join the military as much. No, it's because we no longer have to rely on the CIA filtered news, and we can actually go on the internet and read tons of sources. We can go on Arabic sources, Middle Eastern news sources. We can go on European news sources, and we can read all sorts of information, WikiLeaks, CIA archives, and we can learn the different dimensions and the happenings of the military apparatus, the military industrial complex. And we can read the BS. We can smell it. So, yeah. Before you jump into the pit, smell what they're shoveling. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.